The story of Loretta Saunders begins not with tragedy, but with determination. Born on August 25, 1987, in Happy Valley Goose Bay, Newfoundland and Labrador, Loretta Barbara Grace Saunders came into a world shaped by the enduring strength of Indigenous identity and the scars of colonial legacy. She was an Inuk woman, a member of one of the most resilient yet marginalized communities in Canada. Loretta knew hardship intimately, but she also knew what it meant to fight for something more. As a teenager, Loretta struggled with addiction, unstable housing, and the systemic challenges that disproportionately impact Indigenous youth. But through resilience, self-reflection, and family support, she slowly began to rebuild her life. She returned to school as a mature student, enrolling at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where she studied criminology. Her professors described her as intellectually sharp, intensely curious, and deeply committed to justice, not just in theory, but in lived experience. Loretta's academic focus wasn't random, it was personal. She chose to write her honors thesis on one of Canada's most disturbing crises, the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, MMIWG. These were not just statistics to her. These were women she saw reflected in herself, sisters, mothers, daughters, whose stories had been silenced, ignored, or distorted. She was determined to expose the institutional racism and indifference that allowed these disappearances and murders to continue with impunity. In her research, Loretta conducted interviews with families, studied legal failures, and challenged the structures that allowed such violence to go unchecked. She intended to go to law school after graduation, with the goal of becoming an advocate for Indigenous justice. Every paper she wrote, every page of her thesis, every question she asked in class was aimed at one thing: giving a voice to the voiceless. Her sister Delilah would later say, "Loretta didn't just study injustice. She felt it, she lived it, and she fought to stop it." What no one knew was that Loretta's life would soon mirror the very subject of her thesis, that the tragedy she was working to prevent would become her own reality. Loretta's life in Halifax was a testament to how far she had come. She had found stability, focus, and purpose. She lived with her boyfriend, Luke McIntyre, a quiet, supportive man who respected her academic ambitions. She juggled school, work, and writing her thesis while maintaining a deep connection with her family back in Newfoundland. Her siblings were her best friends, and she often FaceTimed with them or sent messages just to check in. Despite the challenges of university life, she was thriving, emotionally and intellectually. But life as a student in Halifax was expensive. In order to manage rent and living costs, Loretta decided to sublet her apartment while staying temporarily with Luke. She posted an ad on Kijiji, Canada's popular classified site, seeking short-term tenants. It was through this ad that she met Blake Leggett and Victoria Henneberry, a couple in their 20s who said they had just moved to Halifax and needed a place to stay. Loretta was always the type to give people the benefit of the doubt. Despite having no official lease with them, she allowed the couple to move in on an informal arrangement. She charged them a modest rent and expected them to respect the space and her belongings. Initially, things seemed normal, at least on the surface. But Blake and Victoria weren't who they appeared to be. Blake Leggett, originally from Alberta, had a history of violent behavior, truancy, and controlling tendencies. He had dropped out of high school, had run-ins with the law, and was estranged from much of his family. Those who knew him described him as manipulative and dangerous. Victoria Henneberry had a similarly troubled past, though it was marked more by trauma and mental health struggles. She had reportedly been sexually assaulted in her youth, battled depression, and found herself in a toxic, codependent relationship with Blake. While Blake dominated the relationship, Victoria followed, even when it led her down dark paths. The couple lived on the edge of poverty and instability. They rarely held jobs and moved frequently. When they arrived in Halifax, they were essentially drifters, looking for someone kind enough or unsuspecting enough to take them in. Loretta, focused on her studies and committed to helping others, had no reason to suspect the danger lurking behind their quiet faces. Within weeks, the arrangement began to unravel. The couple failed to pay rent consistently and became difficult to reach. Loretta, always composed, was frustrated but not confrontational. She sent reminders, gave warnings, and offered more time. But by early February, her patience was wearing thin. She needed her apartment back, especially to finish her thesis in peace. She arranged to meet with them on February 13, 2014. The purpose was simple: get the rent or ask them to leave. She texted Luke that she'd be back shortly. But she never returned. According to Blake's confession, he tackled Loretta, slammed her to the floor, and began choking her. He claimed she fought back fiercely, but he overpowered her. Victoria stood by, watching. Later, she would say she was too scared to stop him, but prosecutors would argue that she did nothing to help Loretta even after the attack. Once Loretta stopped breathing, Blake dragged her lifeless body to the bedroom. They stuffed her into a hockey bag, zipped it shut, and placed it in the closet. Then, chillingly, they stayed in the apartment for another 2 days, sleeping, watching television, and planning their escape. During that time, they used Loretta's phone to send messages to her family and boyfriend. They pretended she was still alive, offering vague excuses about being busy or needing space. They also attempted to access her bank accounts, trying to steal any funds she had left. By the time they left Halifax in Loretta's car, her body was in the trunk. They were heading west, possibly trying to flee the province or figure out their next move. But the lies they left behind began to crumble quickly. Luke McIntyre reported her missing. So did Delilah and other family members. The police began their investigation, and it wasn't long before the truth started to surface. February 13, 2014 was supposed to be just another day. A quick stop at her apartment to collect rent, then back to her boyfriend Luke to finish her thesis. Loretta left Luke's place sometime in the early afternoon and texted him that she'd be gone for only a short while. She was calm, not expecting trouble. But when hours passed and Loretta didn't return or reply to texts, Luke grew concerned. He called. No answer. At first, he tried to reason with himself. Maybe her phone died. Maybe she ran into a friend. Maybe she was delayed. But deep down, something felt wrong. Meanwhile, inside the apartment, horror had already unfolded. Blake Leggett later described the killing with disturbing casualness. He claimed that Loretta had raised her voice when asking for rent. He admitted to losing his temper, tackling her to the ground. He said he blacked out, but evidence contradicted this. He choked her with his hands, then banged her head against the floor. Forensic details would later reveal the sheer brutality of the act: multiple head injuries, blunt force trauma, and strangulation marks. Victoria Henberry was there the whole time. She claimed she was paralyzed by fear, that Blake was unpredictable, and she worried he would hurt her too. But her actions afterward tell a different story. She didn't call 911. She didn't run for help. Instead, she helped Blake clean up. They wrapped Loretta's body in a blood-stained sheet, then stuffed her into a hockey bag. They zipped it shut and placed it in the closet. The apartment smelled of bleach. They spent the next 2 days living with her corpse only feet away. They didn't panic. They planned. They used Loretta's phone to send texts to her boyfriend, family, and professors, impersonating her to delay suspicion. One message said she was taking time for herself. Another told Luke she was going on a solo trip. They even posted briefly to her Facebook account to make it appear as if she was active. The deception was chillingly effective, if only for a short while. On February 15th, they packed Loretta's body into the trunk of her own car and left Halifax. They took her wallet, her ID, her debit cards. Their destination, Ontario. But even on the road, their plan began to unravel. Back in Halifax, Loretta's absence was setting off alarm bells. Luke, usually calm and reserved, was frantic. It wasn't just that she hadn't come home, it was that she hadn't sent so much of a single real message. Her last known location was her own apartment, now eerily quiet. Luke contacted Loretta's family, including her sister Delilah, who immediately knew something was wrong. Loretta didn't just vanish, Delilah later said. She was responsible. She texted. She called. She didn't ghost people. Delilah and other family members contacted the Halifax police and began pushing for a formal missing persons investigation. At first, they met the familiar wall that many Indigenous families face: hesitation, downplaying, and delays. But Loretta's case had one major difference. She didn't look Indigenous. With her fair skin and light features, she was white passing. That fact, though painful to acknowledge, seemed to prompt faster police action and more media interest than thousands of MMIWG cases before her. By February 17th, the search was official. Police entered her apartment and found traces of blood. Forensic teams were called in. Interviews were conducted with friends and classmates. The investigation ramped up quickly, and so did the media coverage. Delilah took the search to social media. She posted missing posters, gave interviews, and begged people to help find her sister. The campaign went viral. Loretta's story was picked up by major news outlets in Nova Scotia and beyond. This kind of visibility was rare for missing Indigenous women. In her thesis, Loretta had written about the systemic invisibility of Indigenous victims. Now, the irony was sharp. Her story was everywhere because she looked white, while others continued to disappear unnoticed. As police began retracing Loretta's steps, they learned about her recent interaction with tenants Blake Leggett and Victoria Henberry. Their names raised red flags. They had no fixed address, and they weren't answering calls. Police tracked Loretta's car, a blue Toyota Celica, using GPS data. It pinged in Ontario. On February 18th, the search intensified. It didn't take long for authorities to locate Loretta's car. On February 18th, 5 days after she vanished, police in Harrow, Ontario, pulled over the vehicle during a roadside stop. Behind the wheel was Blake Leggett. Victoria Henberry sat in the passenger seat. Neither could provide a consistent explanation for why they had the car. Police were immediately suspicious. The officers noticed inconsistencies in their statements and signs of anxiety. When asked about Loretta, they gave vague responses, claiming she had loaned them the car. But they didn't have a written agreement, and they were in possession of her phone, credit cards, and laptop. The vehicle was impounded. Inside, officers found bloodstains, hair, and a strong smell of bleach. When police searched the trunk, their worst fears were confirmed. They found Loretta's body, wrapped tightly in the hockey bag, shoved under blankets. She had been dead for nearly a week. The couple was arrested on the spot. At first, they were charged with theft and fraud, but as forensic results came back, and with Leggett's confession in hand, the charges escalated to murder. The public reaction was immediate and visceral. The media reported the discovery of Loretta's remains on February 26, 2014. Vigils sprang up across the country, especially in Halifax and her hometown in Newfoundland. Friends, family, classmates, and strangers mourned the loss of a woman who had been working to save others. The fact that she died at the hands of those she tried to treat fairly made the pain even sharper. Her family was devastated. Delilah flew to Halifax to retrieve her sister's belongings and meet with investigators. She also began preparing for a legal battle that would consume the next year of her life. The murder of Loretta Saunders wasn't just a crime. It was a national moment of reckoning. After their arrest in Harrow, Ontario, Blake Leggett and Victoria Henberry were transported back to Nova Scotia under heavy security. The nation was watching. Loretta's murder had ignited outrage, not only because of its brutality, but because it fit an all-too-familiar pattern. A young Indigenous woman killed, her story nearly lost, until public pressure forced action. While in police custody, Blake Leggett began to talk. He first offered fragmented accounts, shifting blame and portraying himself as a victim of circumstance. But eventually, under hours of interrogation and confronted with mounting evidence, Leggett confessed in detail. He admitted to murdering Loretta Saunders on February 13th inside her own apartment. In a cold, matter-of-fact tone, he described tackling her, pinning her down, and choking her with his bare hands. He claimed that Loretta fought back, scratching and resisting, but he overpowered her. She wouldn't stop yelling, he told officers, so I shut her up. After the act, he and Victoria Henneberry stuffed Loretta's body into a hockey bag and left it in the closet. For 2 days, they continued to live in the apartment with her body only steps away. They ordered food, watched TV, slept, all while Loretta lay zipped inside the bag. They used her phone and laptop to impersonate her, sending deceptive messages to her boyfriend, professors, and family. One message to her sister read, "I'm fine, just need to be alone for a bit." Another to her professor asked for an extension on her thesis. Eventually, they loaded the hockey bag into the trunk of Loretta's car and fled Halifax. Along the way, they stopped at gas stations, fast food restaurants, and even shopped using her debit card. They showed no signs of panic, just planning. Leggett admitted they dumped Loretta's body along the Trans-Canada Highway near Salisbury, New Brunswick. On February 26th, police found her remains in a wooded area beside the road. The hockey bag was partially buried under branches and snow. The scene was horrifying. The confession confirmed what Loretta's family had feared, but hearing it crushed them. Delilah Tariak later said, "The worst part wasn't just that she was killed. It was how they tried to erase her, how they used her body, her phone, her name, like she was nothing." With the confessions in hand and forensic evidence secured, the Crown charged Blake Leggett with first-degree murder. For Victoria Henneberry, the situation was more complicated. She had not physically killed Loretta, but she had done nothing to stop it and helped hide the crime. Initially, Henneberry was also charged with first-degree murder, but her defense team negotiated a deal. In exchange for pleading guilty to second-degree murder, she would receive a life sentence with a possibility of parole after 10 years. The deal was met with outrage. To the public and to Loretta's family, Victoria's passive role was still active complicity. She hadn't just watched. She had lied, manipulated, and fled. She didn't stop him. She didn't call for help. She helped cover it up, Delilah said during a press conference. That's not a bystander. That's a participant. The Crown argued that a conviction was more important than a risky trial. A plea deal ensured accountability. But many Indigenous advocates saw it differently. Another example of the justice system going easier on white accomplices than Indigenous victims. As the court proceedings began, national media descended on Halifax. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse holding signs. "Justice for Loretta. She was our sister." And "No more stolen sisters." Indigenous leaders, students, and grassroots groups demanded structural change. Not just in legal outcomes, but in the systems that allowed women like Loretta to be endangered in the first place. The case triggered a rare moment of introspection in Canada. Questions were asked aloud. Why did the system not protect her? Why were her tenants not more thoroughly vetted? Why did police only act quickly because Loretta appeared white? In that moment, Loretta was no longer just a victim. She had become a symbol of a national failure. The trial for Blake Leggett and Victoria Henneberry unfolded over months, with delays, legal arguments, and emotional testimony. Each hearing brought back painful memories for Loretta's family, who flew in from across the country to be present. Luke McIntyre, Loretta's boyfriend, took the stand and described her final hours. He spoke of her last text message, how he waited anxiously for her to return, and how his calls went unanswered. He described the fear he felt that night and the heartbreak of discovering what had really happened. Police officers gave technical testimony, recounting how they tracked the suspects, found the vehicle, and collected evidence. Forensic experts presented details about the murder, blood spatter, strangulation patterns, the timeline of decomposition. But it was Delilah's testimony that brought the courtroom to tears. She spoke of Loretta's childhood, the laughter, the struggles, the strength. She described how Loretta had risen above addiction, returned to school, and dedicated herself to justice. "She was the strongest person I knew," Delilah said, and even in death, she made people listen. Blake Leggett eventually changed his plea to guilty of first-degree murder, removing the need for a full trial. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. Victoria Hedeberry, following her plea deal, received life with eligibility for parole after 10 years. She read a brief, prepared apology. "I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I'm sorry." Few in the room believed her remorse. For Loretta's family, the sentences brought some closure, but not peace. "This wasn't justice," Delilah said outside the courthouse. "Justice would be my sister finishing her thesis. Justice would be her walking across the graduation stage. Justice would be her alive." The courtroom drama ended, but for Loretta's family, and for the many Indigenous families still searching for their daughters, the fight was far from over. When the media coverage faded and the court proceedings ended, most people moved on, but Delilah Tarek could not and would not. She had not only lost her sister, but witnessed the deep cracks in Canada's systems, in how Indigenous women are perceived, protected, and remembered. Delilah's grief began to transform. From sorrow emerged a determination that echoed her sister's own mission. "I couldn't let Loretta die for nothing," she told CBC News in an interview shortly after the sentencing. "She dedicated her life to helping missing Indigenous women. If I stopped now, I'd be erasing everything she stood for." Delilah began speaking publicly, first at memorial vigils and then at universities, town halls, and national rallies. Her voice, though grieving, was unwavering. She educated audiences not just about Loretta's case, but about the broader epidemic of MMIWG. She explained how colonialism, racism, and systemic neglect created a crisis that had lasted for generations. She shared how Loretta had struggled to access safe housing, why she had to sublet her apartment in the first place, and how the very tenants she tried to help ended up taking her life. "This wasn't just a random act of violence," she said. "It was made possible by a society that failed to value Indigenous women." Delilah collaborated with Indigenous activists, women's rights groups, and legal organizations. She co-authored op-eds, spoke at parliamentary hearings, and helped organize candlelight walks across cities from Halifax to Vancouver. Everywhere she went, she carried a photo of Loretta, smiling, blonde-haired, full of life. Each appearance brought emotional pain, but also purpose. "I talk about her murder not because I want to," Delilah said, "but silence is what allowed this to happen in the first place." Loretta had once spoken for the voiceless. Now, her sister had taken the torch. Loretta's murder and the national spotlight it created came at a time when Canada was being forced to confront a long-denied truth: that thousands of Indigenous women and girls had gone missing or been murdered over the decades, and their cases had often been met with apathy. Despite years of advocacy, government after government had failed to act. Police forces were inconsistent in their investigations. Data was missing, fragmented, or simply not collected. Families were left to conduct searches on their own. But Loretta's case stood out. Why? Because her death triggered outrage not only among Indigenous communities, but also among mainstream Canadian society, who couldn't look away. She was educated, she was articulate, young, beautiful, and, most notably, white-passing. These factors, uncomfortable as they were to admit, forced a national conversation. Even media outlets began acknowledging the invisible hierarchy of victimhood in Canada. In Ottawa, members of Parliament debated whether to launch a national inquiry into MMIWG. Indigenous leaders, buoyed by public momentum, renewed their demand. The country needed to formally investigate how and why so many Indigenous women had been lost, and why justice had failed them. Delilah Tarek traveled to Parliament Hill, met with lawmakers, and gave press conferences calling for an inquiry. "You cannot use my sister's name as a symbol," she said, "unless you're willing to back it up with action." Under mounting public pressure, then Prime Minister Stephen Harper remained dismissive. He said in 2014 that the murders of Indigenous women were a criminal matter, not a sociological phenomenon. The comment sparked fury. By 2015, the political landscape shifted. A federal election brought Justin Trudeau to power. Within weeks of taking office, his government announced plans for a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The announcement marked a historic milestone, but it came with caution. Indigenous families, including Loretta's, welcomed the inquiry but demanded transparency, survivor-led leadership, and culturally appropriate processes. Loretta's story had, in many ways, become the symbol that helped tip the scales. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls officially began in September 2016. It was one of the most ambitious truth-seeking efforts in Canadian history. The mandate was broad: to examine the systemic causes of violence against Indigenous women and girls, including the role of institutions like policing, child welfare, healthcare, and the justice system. Families from every province and territory were invited to share their stories. The hearings were held in dozens of communities, from major cities to remote villages. Each session began with traditional ceremonies. Indigenous elders, survivors, and family members testified before commissioners, often through tears. Loretta's name came up repeatedly. Her murder was cited in multiple testimonies as the moment some families realized they needed to come forward. If it could happen to her, one mother said during a Yukon hearing, then none of our daughters are safe. Delilah Teriak also testified, sitting in a public hearing in Nova Scotia. She spoke for hours, recounting Loretta's childhood, her dreams, her passion for advocacy, and her horrific death. She described how the media responded to her sister's appearance and education, while other Indigenous women were ignored or blamed for their own victimization. It shouldn't take a white-passing Indigenous woman with a university degree to get the country's attention, she said in her testimony, but if it did, then we owe it to her to make this moment count. Delilah's testimony was included in the final report, along with the names and stories of hundreds of others. When the report was released in June 2019, it shook the nation. It concluded that the violence against Indigenous women and girls in Canada amounted to a genocide, not only in its human toll, but in its cultural, social, and political dimensions. The report issued 231 calls for justice, demanding urgent reforms in policing, education, health, housing, media, and government. One of the calls was for mandatory anti-racism and trauma-informed training for law enforcement officers, a direct reflection of cases like Loretta's, where police initially delayed action. Another call demanded culturally grounded mental health services for families of the missing, services Delilah said she had to fight to receive. The inquiry was not perfect. It faced criticism for delays, resignations, and communication issues. But for many families, it was a first step in making the invisible visible. And through it all, Loretta's name remained at the center, as both a tragedy and a catalyst. As the years passed, both Blake Leggett and Victoria Henneberry adjusted to life behind bars, but their names were far from forgotten. Blake Leggett, sentenced to life in prison with no parole eligibility for 25 years, was incarcerated in a maximum security facility in Ontario. He largely disappeared from public view. No appeals, no public statements. Inmates who encountered him described him as quiet and cold. He was said to show little remorse, rarely discussing Loretta's murder, except to shift blame toward Victoria. Behind bars, Leggett became a ghost, alive but discarded. He will not be eligible for parole until 2039, when he will be in his late 40s. Victoria Henneberry's fate, however, was far more controversial. Sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 10 years, she began making headlines again as early as 2020. She filed requests to be transferred to a minimum security healing lodge and later applied for escorted temporary absences, requests that stunned the public. Loretta's family, especially Delilah, reacted with fury. She should not be allowed to walk freely in any community, ever, Delilah said in a 2021 interview. She watched my sister be murdered. She helped hide her body. There is no healing from that. The Correctional Service of Canada eventually denied her applications, citing public safety concerns and lack of genuine rehabilitation. But the incident reignited a broader debate. How should the justice system handle accomplices in violent crimes, especially those who claim fear or coercion as defense? Some criminal justice advocates argued that Henneberry had been a victim herself, emotionally manipulated, psychologically dominated by Leggett. Others pointed out that she was an adult with agency who made deliberate choices, including using Loretta's bank card and helping to deceive her family. One thing was certain: Henneberry's early release, if ever granted, would trigger outrage. For Loretta's family, the idea that either of her killers could one day walk free was a lingering wound. In their view, both had taken part in silencing a voice that was fighting for the very people whose stories were so often erased. Even in death, Loretta Saunders' work didn't end, it transformed. In 2015, St. Mary's University in Halifax established the Loretta Saunders Community Scholarship, awarded to Indigenous students pursuing social justice studies. It was a small but powerful recognition of her vision: education as a tool for resistance. Each year, her professors and classmates gather to remember her. Her incomplete thesis on the patterns of police negligence in MMIWG cases was archived at the university, and excerpts were published in academic journals. It continues to inform research and advocacy work across Canada. One of her professors said, "She was already a scholar. She taught us more than we ever taught her." Beyond academia, Loretta's name became a rallying cry. In Halifax, murals featuring her face and traditional Inuit symbolism were painted by Indigenous artists. Marches in her honor became annual events. Red dresses, symbols of missing and murdered Indigenous women, were hung in her memory across college campuses and city squares. Loretta's family helped launch education campaigns to challenge racism, improve reporting mechanisms, and amplify survivor voices. Delilah participated in roundtables with national police forces and testified at Senate hearings about accountability gaps in MMIWG cases. But perhaps Loretta's most lasting legacy is the emotional impact she had on people who never even met her. Women from First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities across the country began sharing their own stories, many for the first time. "I saw myself in her," one Cree student said during a rally in Winnipeg. "She made me believe I could go to school, study law, and still be proud of who I am." Books, documentaries, and podcasts told Loretta's story, always centering her not just as a victim, but as a fighter. One film, titled "She Spoke for Us," became a staple in university classrooms. Another podcast, called Voiceless No More, featured interviews with her family and professors. Her story didn't fade, it grew. It sparked difficult conversations about race, privilege, and the violence embedded in everyday systems. Perhaps the most profound part of Loretta's legacy is this: she changed people, from students to lawmakers, from grieving families to everyday citizens who finally began to see the truth behind the statistics. In one of the last essays Loretta submitted before her death, she wrote, "These women are not just missing, they are missed, and we owe it to them to act like it." That line now appears on memorial plaques, protest signs, and tribute walls. It's a painful reminder that behind every number is a name. Behind every story is a stolen future. Loretta Saunders wasn't just another headline. She was a daughter, a sister, a partner, a student, and an activist. Her life was a journey from trauma to triumph, from silence to scholarship. And her death was a failure, not just of two people, but of institutions, systems, and a country that let it happen. But the story doesn't end there. Canada has a long way to go. Many of the 231 calls for justice from the MMIWG inquiry remain unfulfilled. Indigenous communities continue to sound the alarm over disappearances and uninvestigated deaths. Many families still search for answers, for bodies, for closure. Yet, Loretta's story is a beacon. It forced change, it sparked awareness, it empowered people. And it carries a message to every society facing injustice. One voice can echo forever, if we are brave enough to listen. Today, her family still mourns her. They still set a place for her at gatherings. Her name is spoken with both sadness and pride. And every year, as February approaches, thousands of people across Canada remember her. They wear red, they march, they speak her name. Because she was not just missing, she is still, deeply, endlessly missed.